Wow, I just rewatched that Renaissance one. Wow, that was good. That was some good stuff. Good stuff. Well, here's video number 2. A little bit here on the Reformation. The Reformation. First off, to begin with, here are some of the bigger topics that you're most likely to see in May and also on our test we're taking sooner than May. Martin Luther, obviously. Martin Luther's beliefs. What made Luther Luther? Things like salvation by faith alone. But also, how did Luther deal with the peasants? Those were questions that have been on in the past, so I don't know if they're going to be on there again, but you definitely got to know Luther inside and out. You also got to know the Council of Trent inside and out. Those are 2 topics that I would really focus a lot on. Other things that have appeared some years but not other years. Things like Peace of Westphalia and the Edict of Nantes and Calvinism versus Lutheranism, the 30 Years' War. So I guess I'd studied the 30 Years' War pretty good because Peace of Westphalia, 30 Years' War, Peace of Augsburg, 1555, those things all kind of go together. All right? Which we'll try to get in here too in a second. There's always typically a question on one of those other religions like Calvinism or Anabaptism, but it's hard to tell which one's which. So really focus on Luther, really focus on the Council of Trent, and really focus on those religious wars and the peace treaties that end some of those wars. So here's a quick little 10-minute recap of all things Reformation. All right, so the Reformation overlaps. The Reformation is going to overlap with the Renaissance. The 2 are happening concurrently. The connection between the 2 is the idea of rediscovering the past, rediscovering ancient times and studying ancient times, and getting back into the Bible, obviously, when the Catholic Church or Christianity began. So the popes and secularism and Renaissance, wealth and philosophy and beliefs are going to play a big part in the Reformation. So you had some good things and you had some bad things. So it's not like the Reformation, which is considered starting in 1517 when Luther nails the 95 Thesis to the Church in Wittenberg. They had a ton of issues. Some of those issues were poor leadership. You know, guys that were too involved in money and, you know, having affairs with women and, you know, the secularist world of the Renaissance. But you also had the uneducated. You should remember, I'm going to kind of throw some random things in here. Latin is what educated people spoke. That will change in the 1700s with Louis XIV. Then it becomes French. And obviously in our world today, it's probably English that most people are going to speak. But the church, the Reformation is going to begin and really kick in because the church had issues with declining education. That's what this little tab right here is all about. They weren't getting the education they needed. They're supposed to be speaking in Latin and saving people's souls, and they just weren't smart enough to do that, or at least come across that way. We talked about this before, all the issues with immorality, the drinking, the gambling, and more into you know, living the world of the Renaissance than they were saving people's souls. Absenteeism was a huge one. Remember, benefice is going to be in office. When you have multiple offices or benefices, you can't be in one place. You know, you can only be in one place at a time. You can't be in all these different places. So this led to absenteeism. Well, absenteeism goes back up here with your ignorance and your immorality and these religious people just not doing what they needed to do. All right. You also had, you know, what else do you have? These things were earlier. Babylonian captivity, consider movement, Great Schism, which is written there in red. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because that's earlier stuff, but it's still relevant. It impacts what happens. All right. So church wasn't terrible, though. I had somebody ask me about this. And this is something, you know, as a review question they asked up here about Thomas Kempis and the Imitation of Christ. The point of this slide is the church wasn't terrible. It had a lot of terrible issues, but not everyone was bad. You had the oratories down here in the bottom of divine love, which were women and men reviving the church through prayer. Up here, Thomas Kempis, you know, up there in the north. Radowans is not really the important name. Thomas Kempis is the more important name. They were doing a lot of positives. If everyone in the Catholic Church was like them, the Reformation might not have happened. The church was still incredibly popular. This little thing right here talks about donations and their wills when people died. Every little village, every town had a saint and festivals. And Cardinal Jimenez there, which I won't pull out, is just an example of a positive church person. So not all of them were corrupt like Alexander VI. So we had Martin Luther. Remember his biography, what it was like for him growing up. And then he studies the Bible. Okay, remember the whole idea of throwing himself into the church, trying to figure out what he wants to do. He throws himself into the Bible, and he can't find indulgences. Remember, though, ultimately the issue that indulgences expose is the idea of how is one saved. All right, and one is saved, one gets to heaven, because that's what people cared about. That dominated the Middle Ages because people were dying very young. As time improves, people get less and less involved in the church, but here they still care greatly about their souls and about their afterlife. And if you're not, you know, doing what you need to do to get to heaven, it's going to be even worse in hell than it is on earth, and earth is pretty bad for these people. So these are just little things that point out all the different steps. All right, and I only have 10 minutes, so we're not going very fast, but you have the 95 thesis published. Johann Tetzel is the guy that created these indulgences. That's an example of a picture of an indulgence from a church in Germany that you could go look at. A coin in the coffer rings your soul from purgatory springs. So hopefully you remember what indulgences are. Luther attacks them. He has to defend his position with this great debate, and eventually he'll be excommunicated. And he'll write a ton of books. As I said a few minutes ago, knowing Luther, knowing his books, it is well worth your time to study Luther. All right. Is it going to be 20 questions? No, but it could be 2 or 3. What are the most important ones on Christian liberty here? This is the basis for what he says after 95 thesis, when he writes this 3 years later. This is the one that says a Christian man is subject to no one. That inspires peasant revolts. There's been questions on Luther and peasant revolts, which leads to him writing this. This one is also related, where he talks about, well, just what it sounds like. We need peace. We need stability. This is not a Luther book, but it's inspired by Luther's beliefs, and it's these peasants asking for, rights and privileges. Swabia is a part of what we would call Germany today. And then the catechisms on the bottom are just mapping on his philosophy. So moving along quickly, John Calvin, one word, predestination. There's a little bit more to it, but we're doing it quickly, predestination. Anabaptists, there's this little cartoon. Anabaptists, the big thing right here is separation of church and state. They got also some kind of interesting things with women in the ministry. They're the most radical kind of goofy group, but they inspired the most in the future. And this is just what it means. Zwingli is just a fighter. Has a lot of similarities to Luther, but he's probably the least important one we want to talk about. Not to be mean to Zwingli, but that's just the way it is. All right. England is different. This is real simple. The point of this slide, there's 3 interesting things here with the English and Henry VIII. Number 1 is Henry VIII obviously is going to start the Anglican Church, his version of Catholicism, because he wanted to get a divorce. The 2 interesting things that bookend that. So that's obviously the key component of the English Reformation. Nothing to do with philosophy, everything to do with who's in charge of the church. Nothing to do with beliefs, just who's going to be basically the Pope for the English church. But the other part, before that, there were people, and that's what this slide is all about. The Lollards are people before Henry VIII does anything that didn't like what the church was doing. You can see by the dates, you can see what they were doing. They were Reformation people before the Reformation was cool. So it's not like Henry VIII was starting something that hadn't been thought about. And then when Henry VIII starts it, as I've said a couple times now, it's about getting a divorce. It has nothing to do with philosophy. It has nothing to do with beliefs. It's just like, hey, I want to get rid of Catherine of Aragon to have a son. The other end of the Reformation is the Pilgrimage of Grace. The Pilgrimage of Grace we talked briefly about. That is where the Catholics fight back. So it's interesting because Henry VIII starts the church for the reason he starts the church. Prior to that, there was real Reformation ideas he did nothing with, and after he starts the church, you have Catholics fired up again. So it's kind of interesting if you look at it that way. All right, runs through the wives. Wives and children, are you going to see a question on that? No. All right, but remember there are 6 of them. These are good possible questions because they're real history with real impact. All right, they're not going to ask you to memorize the wives. Thomas More's interesting. I can throw a few seconds in on him here because he's a humanist. Remember, this overlaps. Reformation, Renaissance overlap. He was an English humanist that wrote Utopia, Perfect World, very educated. He refuses to help Henry get this divorce. He gets his head chopped off. So knowing these acts, this puts him in charge of the church. These are steps to get to that. All right, and then you have, some other things otherwise. I'm going to quickly run through these without talking about them because I want to get to, well, one more thing here. Dissolving the monasteries is big. All right, that is taking church property and making it his. All right, sells it off, rewards his friends, and goes from there. Talked about that already. Then remember, Edward starts to create a holy book of prayer, a book of common prayer, I should say. Then Mary makes them Catholic, kills a bunch of Protestants. Elizabethan settlement is going to make them officially Anglican, but you do whatever you want in the privacy of your home. Ireland stays Catholic. John Knox is a Calvinist. All right, real quick, my final 2 minutes in video number 2 is done. I got to go. Oh, yeah, look at who appealed to Luther. Educated people liked him. Working class people liked him because he saved them a lot of money. Okay? Those are good parts of your book. I want to spend real quick on the Counter-Reformation in my remaining few seconds here. The Council of Trent is big. There's 2 parts to what the Catholics did. All right? They are going to try their own Reformation before Luther makes a big deal out of it. When he makes a big deal out of it, Reformation kicks in. Later on, they're going to try to battle back and make some changes. The big thing is reconciliation never happens. The Catholics refuse to change their views on any of these things. But if you're Catholic today, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. They are confident in what they teach. They believe in what they teach, and that's good for Catholics today. Didn't help them reconcile with all the Protestants back then. This is a failure. This is a success. All right? What else did we have in this time period real quick? Oh, some positives. Ooh, how could I forget? Huge, big, Jesuits. Part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation was finding new Catholics, Catholics that hadn't been exposed to all the terrible things of Luther and Calvin. So the Jesuits are going to go to Africa, more South America, and they're going to convert these people that don't know what this is all about to Catholicism. Jesuit colleges today, some people trying to go to Loyola Chicago, Marquette, Xavier, places like that are all Jesuit schools. And so missionaries is a big part. And Jesuit education was a huge, most important education you could have throughout the 15, 16, 1700s. All right? And I think that pretty much wraps this thing up. A real quick 14 minutes on the Reformation. 1320